You cannot take a dilute form of energy, make it more dilute, double the size of the grid, more panels, more wind turbines, and get to a solution. Why is AEMO doing this? It is because they have a firm religious belief that this is possible.
I'm Tom Switzer and I'm the Executive Director here at the Centre for Independent Studies. We at CIS, and we've just set up a program in the last 6 months, we believe that if the efficiency and wealth generated by fossil fuels are to be displaced, we should seriously take the prospect of using nuclear energy to reduce our carbon footprint. Indeed, nuclear is uniquely placed to replace coal and later even gas from the grid. If you look at France, I think it took France something like 15 years to switch almost its entire grid from fossil fuels to nuclear. And the question here is, can we do the same here in this country? Now, our first detailed report on the subject was released recently. It's by my colleague Aidan Morrison, who heads our energy program. And it's called How to Build Low-Cost Nuclear, Lessons from the World. If you haven't got a copy, you can at the lobby, and it can be downloaded on our website, cis.org.au. And of course, today we have a great discussion on the subject. Now, to help set the scene, it's my great pleasure to introduce Chris Uhlmann. Chris is no stranger to many of you, having been a prominent member of the Canberra Press Gallery for many decades. He distinguished himself at the ABC with his outstanding political interviews. In my judgment, he was probably the best political interviewer in the country in the 2000s and the 2010s. And then he went to the Nine Network, where he also was a columnist at The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. And again, he distinguished himself as a leading expert on not just the energy transition, but also the great China policy debates. These days, Chris is at Sky News. He's just started there, and he's also a columnist with the Australian newspaper. Please welcome Chris Uhlmann.
Thank you, Thomas. It's an honour to be here at the Centre for Independent Studies today for this extremely important debate, because both major parties have said that we are going to hit net zero by 2050. So there's no question about that. We're not here to debate that. The Labor Party says that we're going to... The Labor Party says that we're going to have 43% lower carbon emissions by under 2005 levels by 2030. That is just 6 years away. You often hear people say that, that electricity generation is undergoing a once-in-a-century transformation. Well, it's much more than that. It's a once-in-a-century transformation with experimental technologies. So what we're going to look at today is, are we on the right path, and is there a plan B? Are there things that we should be considering? Because we're not debating whether or not we're going to decarbonise the grid. And some of the figures that stand out to me about what's going to happen in the next 26 years, the Energy Security Board said that we need 7 times the generation that we built in the last 25 in the next 26 years. 7 times the generation. We're going to need 10,000 kilometres of new transmission lines built in that time. We need an we need a workforce in the next 7 years of 42,000 more electricians than we have now. Start considering some of the numbers that people are throwing out, and then put this proposition alongside it. How are we going to do that? Well, to shed some light on that today, we're going to talk about the possibility of using nuclear in the system, and we have a great panel. We have Helen Cook, who is the world's leading nuclear legal expert. Would you please come up, please, Helen? I think your name's on your seat. We have Aidan Morrison, who is the Director of Energy Research at CIS. Aidan. And we are honoured to have A.D. Paterson, who is the former CEO of the Australian Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation. Please make a motion. So, Aidan, you have written this paper, How to Build Low-Cost Nuclear. So could we begin by you giving us a bit of a précis about what's in here?
Sure. We approached this paper with trying to sort of unpick what I think is a myth, that there is a price, a cost for nuclear, by considering the diversity of all the different places around the world that have quite a bit of it, and considering the bit of the history of the runs that they've got on the board and trying to figure out, is there any distinguishing features? Are there patterns here that we can learn from so that we get the best version of it and then we get something that is cheaper than some of the recent cases that have been touted often by opponents of nuclear, showing that nuclear is expensive. And nuclear is very capital intensive. There's no doubt about that. It sits up at the end of the spectrum where you invest more in building the machine up front to have lower environmental impact and lower operating costs through its life. So it's a critical question about how you get that first piece right. And to sort of try to cut a long story very, very short, we looked at the lessons around the world. There's 4 lessons, and you can read those in detail. But if I was to try to distill it into just kind of one to pick that meant that you had a total game-changing difference in the cost of nuclear, don't just buy one and hope that that is going to be cheap off the bat. And that just seems to be this overwhelming kind of theme that we found. All the reactors that have been built recently, oddly enough in the West, are either first of a kind or first in living memory or first with this team or first in country. And all the countries that have done it, including Finland, France recently, the United Kingdom, the United States, have just built 1 or 2 often of the first type of reactor they built. And it really seems quite compelling and quite striking when you look around the world. The countries that have managed to make nuclear power quite affordable, they don't do that. They build them in 4s and 6s and 8s. And in fact, the average number of reactors per station, which often corresponds to per project in countries like Canada, etc., are up around those kind of numbers. The United States is the exception. They have almost all the nuclear power in 1s and 2s, and I think only 1 or 2 plants that reach 3. So the lesson from the world is don't do this half-heartedly. It can be done quite affordably, but you can't take too small a bite of this apple. Do it with confidence, and nuclear can be done very cost-effectively.
Helen, one big problem in Australia is there is an effective ban on building nuclear energy here. You deal with the legal environment, so can you talk us through a couple of things? One is, what kind of regulatory environment would you need to build? And you have to overcome that initial legal hurdle in the first place. So what kind of time frame are we talking about to get the regulatory system up?
Thanks, Chris. That's a very important question. It's a discussion that I am hearing more and more frequently in Australia, is that nuclear is going to take too long, and in part because you do need to set up what I call the legal and regulatory infrastructure, the enabling legal and regulatory infrastructure to be able to build nuclear plants in this country. And the first point for us, as you say, would be overturning those prohibitions that we have today. But that's just the starting point, because you do need to put in place a national legal infrastructure, and you need to set up a nuclear regulatory body that will oversee a licensing process for the plants that you're going to construct, and then will oversee the day-to-day operation of the units from that regulatory perspective. But the key point that I want to make is the International Atomic Energy Agency says that a country can go from merely considering nuclear energy to having nuclear electrons on the grid within 10 to 15 years, and that's including large nuclear power plants. Australia is not a country that's starting from scratch. So we have a mining industry, we sell our uranium to the world, we have one of the world's leading nuclear research reactors on the outskirts of Sydney, we have an existing nuclear regulatory body that oversees that. We're considered world-leading voices when it comes to topics of nuclear security and nuclear non-proliferation internationally, and we have excellent legal regimes in place already today. So we are not a country that is starting from scratch by any means. And as I look around the world at the more than 50 countries that today do not have nuclear energy but are working towards having nuclear energy, and they're doing this, actually putting the laws and the regulations in place and setting up the institutions, I keep thinking that Australia has to be one of the best positioned, if not the best positioned country, to be able to move forward with nuclear at a rapid rate. And one of the reasons that I think we can do this at a very on a very expeditious time frame is because we have the benefit of looking around the world and assessing, like Aidan has just done, what has gone right in the world of nuclear regulation around the world, what works, what doesn't work, what has hampered and delayed the rollout of nuclear energy unnecessarily around the world. And we actually have the opportunity in Australia to put in place a fit-for-purpose, effective nuclear regulatory regime that can be an effective road an effective barrier to entry to the sector, but not a roadblock, as we do see in some regulatory regimes around the world.
So, Adi, you actually have run that nuclear reactor. So can you tell us and talk us through what kind of workforce would we need? How long would it take us to skill up the people that would be needed to build this if we ever get past the legal hurdles?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Chris, and good day, everybody. The Opal reactor is a really interesting story because it was a ninth of a kind reactor. The Argentinians who built it had already built 8. They were building one in Egypt, and then they built the Opal reactor from breaking ground. They found a couple of problems with the geology. That slowed us down a bit till the first sort of heat out of the reactor. We're not allowed to make electrons. In fact, I wanted to put a little Stirling engine on one of the heat pipes, and they told me I'd go straight to jail, right? As those of you know what a Stirling engine is, that's cool. But basically, that was a world-class build program, and it really took an existing workforce capability that was great engineers here in Australia, constructed it, built it, and began to operate it. Pretty much on the timeline, the best timeline that you could get. There were a few wrinkles here and there. As I say, with finding a bit of geological problems, they decided that there was a little bit of an ancient fault that needed to be examined and a few other things. But even with the toxic environment in which that reactor was built, and the stress that the workforce would go under sometimes when the protests were at the gate and that sort of thing, we now have the world's best operating 20 megawatt class reactor that supplies nuclear medicines right across the world. In fact, if you're frightened of radiation, don't go to any hospital that's got a nuclear medicine department, because we safely deliver nuclear medicine past all of the no nuclear in this Marrickville signs to the nearest hospital, where it's used diagnostically to find out what's going on in your body or therapeutically to treat your cancer every day of the week. So that every Australian will have at least one nuclear medicine procedure in their life. And we think now with the new therapeutic ones, probably 2. So you live in a nuclear world where radiation is taken to all of the hospitals every day. By the way, waste is sorted out. We have the world's first Synrock plant ready to go for all of the nuclear waste that is produced in nuclear medicine production. That was my favorite project, by the way. Ziggy Switkowski said to me when he hired me, "Adi, I want you to make Synrock work or stop talking about it." And Ted Ringwood's wonderful invention was turned by a team of Australian engineers, young engineers and scientists, into a working brand new waste management technology which is unique in the world and which had never been done before in 8 years. In 8 years. And it is a certified operating facility. You just haven't got enough waste for it yet. So, universal rules, I think at Australia with intent, and the intent will come when the lights begin to go out. The frequency is already completely destroyed, by the way, and we're losing businesses. When the lights start to go out in the offices of people in politics, they will get an urgent need to get this done.
And so let's go to that point, because if you listen to the government and the way that it speaks about the energy transition, we can have cheap and abundant energy just using wind, solar and storage, although the storage part of it's always that bit which is yet to be discussed somewhere over the horizon. So obviously you 3 are of the opinion that that roadmap, which is plan A and plan B as far as I can tell, will not work. Why won't it work? And Helen, we might start with you.
I'm actually probably the least well qualified to answer that question as a lawyer, so I might pass it.
Okay,
Sorry,
no
Chris,
worries.
I might pass it to someone else.
Good question. I look, my approach is that for some cost, if you really had no limit to the dollars you're willing to spend, you might make it work eventually. But what I think is really shocking and troubling is that we have not yet had a serious and objective analysis of what that true cost would look like. The papers that have been done at the moment that are frequently referred to are...
we have Gen Cost from the CSIRO.
We have Gen Cost and the Integrated System Plan from AEMO. So neither of those two documents do a proper holistic analysis of the full integrated system costs. And so So I think that's the simple reason. Is that I am a techno-optimist in the sense that I think that we could engineer something to fill in all the gaps. There are big problems, which Adi will probably leap on in a moment, about the running the frequency and a few other things. There's a few other kind of hopefuls that we assume we can solve. If I put a bit of a techno-optimist hat on, I'd say we can solve them at a cost, but we have not been honest or even remotely serious about being honest about what that true cost is. And, quick plug, we will have the next major paper from the energy program will be released on Thursday, and it's called the 6 Fundamental Flaws Underpinning the Energy Transition, and that will be, hopefully, the comprehensive go-to of how we've failed to cost that in the future.
Yeah. Just in terms of coming from the ground up and doing the engineering, I can promise you that the 85% plan of AEMO is a paper plan. It has no foundation in the engineering. And as optimistic as you like, you cannot build the grid that is talked about in the AEMO plan with the resources they talk about, holding it together and get anything like a viable economy. So let me give you a couple of facts. On average, the wind in Australia blows between 2 days a week and less than that. You thought I was going to say more, didn't you? Okay, so how do you get from 2 out of 5? I'm talking about the working week, of course. Weekends, you give the system more, it takes a rest. 2 out of 5 days, 40%. I just want to be clear, it's a 5-day week I'm talking about, the one that works, not the one that doesn't work. 40% of the time is about the average wind. In fact, it's 37.5 globally. For all the wind turbines everywhere in the world, you take the average 37.5. Our best wind's about 42. Let's be generous and say that it's 40%. That is 2 days out of 5. The people who fight with me on LinkedIn and say, yes, 80, but the wind blows all the time somewhere. The answer is no. You will find over the next 9 days in Sydney, there's an East Coast block, high pressure zone to the south of us at the moment, and we will not have reliable wind, I predict, for at least 5 days, and probably for 9 days. So just watch the next 9 days. We will not have enough wind to drive our wind turbines to produce the electricity we need. I want to jump quickly to batteries. I had a battery group at CSR in South Africa. I sold lithium battery patents to the Japanese. Speak to me afterwards. I know what batteries can do, and they can't do it. The last piece of the puzzle, of course, is solar. And, of course, we have invented solar, a great team at the University of New South Wales. The money is made in China. They sell it back to us. And the sun goes down at night. I hate to admit this, but the solar panels on my roof are not paying themselves. And then the operators stole my feed-in tariff, so I can't even pay them back. And so if you're in a high-rise in Sydney and you're relying on the electrons that keep the emergency rooms, the sewage, all of the things like the aeroplanes in the air at the night, the critical facilities that keep our road system operating and so on, you're not going to do it with solar and wind. We will fail at 40% on average solar and wind, which means we're starting to fail now. The 85% plan is impossible from an engineering point of view. I am prepared to debate this with anybody from anywhere in Australia in detail. It is not true. We used to call that a lie, but you're not allowed to say it anymore because it triggers people or something. But it's a not truth, and it's a dangerous not truth.
So,
Sorry, if I could just chime in, I guess, from the international perspective as well, because, of course, there are countries around the world that are running an experiment and actually probably started running their experiments before we did. And I think there's someone in the room who can talk very clearly to whether there are any examples in the world of countries that have been able to completely decarbonise their energy systems effectively with nuclear, and I believe the answer is no. And if we look at some of those examples, and we just give the obvious one of Germany, we don't even have to talk about Germany's increasing carbon emissions or Germany's high electricity prices. We can also mention the fact that Germany sits next to a country called France. And France has one of the most sophisticated, enviable nuclear programs in the world. It, as Chris said, it built many reactors very early on, 56 reactors in 15 years. It has all of the fuel cycle covered except for uranium, and it can buy that from friendly countries like us. It really has an incredible nuclear energy program, some of the cheapest energy, electricity, which it can export to neighbouring country Germany. We're an island. We don't have people coming to our aid like countries running this experiment around the world.
And you were also saying just a little earlier that there are 50 countries who are considering nuclear energy, and you are at the table for these conversations. So these are plans that are reasonably well advanced.
Absolutely. So I just came home from a trip to the Philippines. I've been advising the Philippines government for over a year now. They actually have a nuclear power plant that was built in the 80s, but then there was a change of president, and all the projects of the former president were abandoned, and the nuclear plant was one of them. So the Bataan nuclear power plant sits there. It's never been commissioned. But today, the Philippines is looking to embark on a very ambitious nuclear energy program, and to that end, they are drafting laws and regulations and setting up their institutions to move ahead with a nuclear energy program where they hope not only to see the start of Bataan, but also electrons on the grid, nuclear electrons on the grid within this decade. Of those 50 countries that are moving in this direction, there are countries that also have similar timelines to that. They want to see new nuclear before 2030. They want to see new nuclear before 2035. Very ambitious timelines. And I just come back to, why can't we achieve that when some of these countries have far lower GDPs per capita than we do? They have far less of a starting point than we do. We absolutely can do it, but what it will take is that political will, is that whole of government approach, and is a very serious effort to form strategic partnerships with the vendor supplier countries, which will be absolutely crucial to enabling us to roll out nuclear here.
And one of the things that constantly strikes me about this debate is, if the government doesn't believe that this will work, lift the ban, have the debate. Why is it, it seems to me, that Australia is completely captured by the weather-dependent renewables as the only way forward, when surely if we want to decarbonise, we should be looking at the best, cheapest, fastest way to cut carbon emissions from electricity? Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
Oh, I mean, I think that no, I don't have a good answer for that. It's a really strange thing. I mean, the ban we arrived at by a quirk of political accidents, a horse trading deal to get the nuclear medicine passed and have the independence of a brilliant research and nuclear medicine facility in Australia. So we inherited the ban by accident, and now I think there is no sensible defence of banning something that could be such a viable, very low carbon. Like if we want to seriously decarbonise, deep decarbonisation, not the easy 20, 30, 40%, but deep decarbonisation, nuclear seems almost essential. So leaving it banned, I just can't see how anyone would can justify that. I think keeping the ban in place, I just challenge anyone to say, give us your best logical argument for keeping the ban in place. And I think it comes to a place where more or less trying to protect and prevent real comparisons, and that's something that we've seen that is unfortunately the case. Other regulatory institutions who are seen as the technical authorities can hide behind the ban and say, no, sorry, we won't consider costing that. So, for example, AEMO's Integrated System Plan, they have to say what's the next best, cheapest way, but we won't consider nuclear. And so once you take nuclear off the table, you'll find there's just no other way of meeting all the ambitious carbon reduction targets to be considered. So they say we found the cheapest way when there's only one way that's been considered, and they don't even add up the full cost. So I think the ban has created basically a toxic environment in terms of allowing a very unthorough and non-holistic comparison to be done, including by what should be the respected and independent technical authorities whose job it is to kind of lay out the information that we should be using to make the economic decisions. So that's the impact, and I think it's indefensible. I can't see any good reason to defend it at all.
My sense is that it comes from the atom bomb testing by the UK government in the Second World War. When I really push people, particularly people of an older generation than myself, and say, what's the problem with nuclear? Why does the ban exist? Certainly some of it comes from the green movement, People have a deep memory of people imposing something on them that they didn't want and doing things that were unconscionable and not well managed. But this is not a nuclear bomb program. This is the best program for Australia's best future with the lowest carbon economy with always on low cost electrons. We've never reframed or properly admitted that there is a deep residual fear. And I've sat around many tables of an evening talking to people who are passionately against nuclear. And when you really scratch them, it comes to this thing of a deeply embedded sense that the social license was lost in the atomic bomb testing in the Second World War. And to get back that social license, somebody's going to have to bleed for that. Well, I'm bleeding for it now.
Well, I like to blame the French.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
the nuclear testing in the Pacific, I think, was a huge part of this.
It was followed by the emergence of Greenpeace and so on. But the Japanese got over the nuclear testing in the Pacific, and they've got a wonderful fleet of nuclear reactors that came from GE and other people. They've got an amazing fleet of really successful ones. Fukushima wasn't a nuclear accident. It was the failure to have a diesel that wasn't in the basement. Okay. There was no nuclear accident. There was a little bit of fuel melting and a little bit of a plume. But all of the calculations show that nobody will die from Fukushima apart from a couple of really brave people who try to deal with the fact that there wasn't any electricity. Chernobyl, similarly, the 56 people who died were very brave people who knew they were going to die and has shut down Chernobyl so it wasn't more of a big disaster. They were brave firefighters and so on, and the helicopter pilots and so on. So when people use Chernobyl and Fukushima, it just generates a sort of visceral anger in me. It's a determined desire to say something that is true that is not based on the facts of history. We need to get over our history and embrace our future and get a nuclear future that's based on great law, which Helen's going to talk about.
I was actually going to just talk a little bit about that concept of future, because I think it's one that's really important in the context of nuclear energy. We are, I think, really focused on the next decade, and I think that's admirable, that's great, and in my opinion, we need to be making sure we're positioned to have the option for nuclear as quickly as possible, including within the next decade. But I'm also concerned by 2050, but maybe even more so, I'm concerned about what happens after 2050. So if I look at my two young daughters, they won't even be 30 by that on that timeline. So they'll have more than the rest of their lives, I hope, to live. If we want to actually institute something that is lasting, that is sustainable, that is intergenerational, then we need to think beyond the next decade. We need to think beyond the life of wind and solar. We need to think about technologies like nuclear energy, and we need to think about what you actually get when you turn them on. And what you get is 60 years design life, potentially 80, potentially 100. So even if it takes us 10 years to get it, even if it would take us 15 years to get it, worst case it takes longer, what you get is really, really significant. It is base load, always on, reliable, affordable, sustainable into the future, and I think it makes a real impact on the future.
Did you want to say something?
I couldn't agree more. I think that it's odd that there is a sense. No, it's not odd there is a sense of urgency. I understand that there is a sense of urgency, but I feel like the conclusion that we'll come to is almost inevitable if we want to have completely clean power for the long term. Because, guess what? What happens for the next 50 years after 2050 is probably at least as important for society and the climate, the planet, as what happens in the next 6 years to 2030, right? So getting to a solution that is sustainable is an imperative, and we'll have to get there eventually. And I feel like it's a sort of luxurious position to be in as a nuclear advocate, to say, well, it doesn't matter if we don't win this year, because actually next year it will still be the best thing to do. And you can even build a few more solar panels if you want. You have to replace them every 20, 25 years. Eventually you'll realise that's the most expensive solution. Germany eventually, hopefully they're 5 or 10 years ahead, eventually they will realise you won't be able to get and sustain the direction we're heading in. So I think it's just a question of when and how much more do we pay in unnecessary experiments on the way there. But I think that as a nuclear advocate, I feel confident that eventually, after enough failed attempts, after enough misfires, we'll have to get there eventually. So we should do it considered, take the time to get it right, and start to get going now.
Just 2 points on that, I guess. The first is, if we don't start now, we're always going to be that amount of time away. So is it 10, is it 15, is it 5, whatever it is, if we just sit and wait, whether it's the next election cycle or the next, we'll always be that far away. The second point, and the point that actually keeps me up the most at night, is knowing what's happening around the rest of the world. It is seeing the order books of the vendors filling up. It is knowing that the Philippines wants to place an order very soon. It's knowing that the government of Estonia is next in line to Poland. There's Polish interests that have placed orders for 40 plus SMRs. Like, we need to take action to get some credibility out there in the world, or the vendor order books are going to, keep us on the back foot as well.
One of the things that always strikes me about this debate is that the people who are driving a lot of it are those who want us to declare a climate emergency. So if you imagine you've just hit the iceberg and you're in the Titanic, and someone says, no, you can't use those nuclear-powered boats on that side, you've got to use the entirely renewable-powered ones on this side. If there's emergency, you put all boats out, don't you? You actually have the conversation about what might or might not work. The other thing for those people who are desperate to see the end of coal-fired power, the good news is that we have a timetable for that. That will be gone under the current timetable by 2038, which is, again, not that far away. The problem is the gap that arises. So a big part of this debate too is about affordability. We're told when there's more renewable energy in the system, it's cheaper, so therefore the price of electricity will fall. Do you think that governments need to come clean about whatever trajectory we're on, electricity prices are not going down, are they?
You go first, Aidan, I'll follow.
Sure, yeah, that's absolutely right. And the remarkable thing is there is attempts repeatedly made at key junctions to claim the opposite. And I think that one particular press release about a week ago is one worth pointing out, when AEMO released a press release saying that now, despite increasing demand, renewable energy was pushing power prices down. And this is just such I would say not even an attempt at a serious analysis, because the wholesale electricity price, which was the new stats they're reporting, are not your electricity bill. You pay for all the rest of the transmission and distribution infrastructure as well. So they're sort of starting on the wrong foot to begin with. And then as well, they had a time-weighted average, which counts all the times when we don't actually need much from the grid in the sun, and because it's daytime. So that simply debased their analysis and they did mention in their press release, but avoided the conclusion as well. The gas price had fallen, and gas actually does set the price for most of the high volume, critical kind of high demand periods. So kind of 1, 2, 3 kind of multiple layers of not attempting to take analysis seriously, and then arriving and announcing as the technical authority, by the way. AEMO is the market operator, is the guys that you go to, right? If you were, aliens from space would say, who would you ask about what's causing power prices to go down? You'd go to AEMO. You'd go to the technical authority, right? And they're producing this and announcing in their headlines a causal relationship. And I think on closer inspection, it simply doesn't add up. And you have to ask yourself the question, why is this narrative still being supported, still being repeated, when scratching the surface reveals that the technical authority is not doing the technical analysis that we would expect of them. And in fact, in the long term, even the regulator has just told all the retailers to take a haircut. That was the announcement of not having an increase in your power bills in the last draft default market offer. So the regulator said the energy retailers to take a haircut. That's what stopped the prices rising again. And yet that's touted by the minister as being reason to think that renewables are a cause for thanks for this. So it's deeply worrying. It absolutely whole new paper coming on it. So don't get me started on it. But that is a serious concern. I think the degree to which technical analysis is not being used to produce an objective, credible result on that front.
I think the way that I'd like to explain it to you is the Opal card. I went out to have a meal somewhere on the far side of the harbour. I won't tell you where it was because you'd want to go there. I had a wonderful day. So Kath and I went out there from Sutherland, took the train in, got the ferry, came back, got to Sutherland, picked up the car, worked out that to get the car from Sutherland to Miranda cost more than the $2.50 it cost me on a Saturday to do the rest of the trip. On a very expensive train line with a reliable schedule that is always on and where you can look on an app and it'll tell you when the next train will be there. We're replacing that train system, that grid system that's based on reliable generators, with buying everybody in Australia a bicycle. And I've done the maths. It is cheaper to buy everybody in Australia a bicycle, including the people running the ambulances and the people who are delivering your food and so on, and to completely replace all of the train systems and all of the systems that deliver your Woolies goods to you and so on. It is cheaper to buy everybody a bicycle and a delivery bicycle and a push a bicycle up a hill. In fact, and even a team to push the people with the bicycles up the hill because it's hard work. That's what intermittent renewables are. They're only there when another source of power is there, the sun, okay, or the wind, and they are unreliable, unpredictable. They're like kids on a bicycle. And they always have to be supervised, even on the road from Sutherland to Miranda. Okay. This analogy is absolutely accurate, and I call on anybody who doesn't agree with me. I'll even give you a battery-powered bicycle and see if you can keep it charged. All right. By the way, have you ever tried to work out on your stationary bicycle at home that you're using to keep you fit as to whether you will make enough energy to take that battery from that you've just charged to put into your bicycle battery to get you to work? The answer is I've done that calculation, very simple version, and I would have to have my whole family riding the bicycle for 28 hours a day to get me to work. All right. You cannot take a dilute form of energy, make it more dilute, double the size of the grid, more panels, more wind turbines, and get to a solution. Why is AEMO doing this? It is because they have a firm religious belief that this is possible. I believe that the CEO of AEMO is not in any way, in his mind, trying to deceive us. He is a genuine believer in this cult. It's the bicycle energy and push it up the hill cult. It will not work. All of the people I know that used to do the sort of work that we're talking about here, who worked in AEMO, the engineers and so on, have left. It's too toxic for them to work because you can't sit in the tea room and have a conversation when you're in a cult. They drive you out. So I'm hoping to find one because I need to get some inside information occasionally. But the bottom line is we have got a captured cult defining our energy future because there's no plausible engineering basis for this. Dr. Robert Barr has proved this. Where's Steve? Steve has proved this independently and with a separate method. Robert Barr, by the way, has done it on hourly data for 2 years of the weather system. Last point I'd make is I have been to the International Meteorological Organization in Geneva. I negotiated some agreements when I was in the Department of Science and Technology as a sort of deputy secretary. I have negotiated in that climate place. Do you know what one climate data point is when they say the climate is changing? The official definition of one climate data point, how many years? Think of a number. No, multiply that by 6. 30 years is one data point. 2 data points to draw your first straight line between them, 60 years. How many people under 60 here? Oh, not many. I knew I shouldn't say.
Wrong audience.
So all of you who are under 60 have not got to your second data climate point. So you're the straight line people. Anybody here 90 years old? Anybody 90? No. 90 years, you can start to see what's happening to the climate. I'm actually a bit of a climate geek. I spend days and days looking at weather maps and comparing. So when anybody says that the climate is changing, you say, which 60 years are you talking about? Okay. When they say this weather event is a result of climate change, you say, I already know that's a lie. How long is a single data point for climate? It's really important that we undo this myth that we attribute extreme events to climate and everything else is weather. It's not true. In fact, there's no correlation. You can't make a correlation between extreme events and climate. It takes you 90 years to find out.
Just to pick up on your point of ideologies, I think it's actually really unfortunate that we have these ideologies around nuclear and around wind and solar. It seems to be easy for people when you are pro-nuclear to cast you as anti-wind and solar. Now, I just would speak for myself here by saying very clearly that I think there's a place for bicycles. I like to see some people riding bicycles. I think we need wind and solar. I want to see wind and solar, but I want to see the right combination of technologies that is also going to ensure that we have the lights staying on and jobs staying in Australia and continue our industrialisation, et cetera. And so, I do think it's unfortunate that we end up in this ideological debate rather than a debate based on facts and science, and a debate where we pitch nuclear against wind and solar, because I do not think that is what we should be doing. We need the right mix. What the combination is, I'm a lawyer, I don't know, but it should be a mix, and we should be able to talk pro-nuclear without being seen as anti-wind and solar.
And I'd like people to start considering, we've got a very highly educated audience here and very interested in this debate. So if you have a question, so ponder it for a second, I'll ask one more and then we might go to the floor. But there's one more thing I want to bring into this. We're constantly talking about decarbonising the electricity grid. That's 20% of the problem. The other is primary energy. And, the last 20 years, I think the world's gone from 87% fossil fuel in primary energy, so producing steels, producing concrete, producing plastic, producing ammonia. So how important is this kind of energy in maintaining an industrial production base in Australia? And what will happen if we don't have this kind of energy?
Yeah. So process heat, as we call it, is really, really important. So normally in most high temperature power plants, use some of the heat to make electricity, but use a lot of the heat to feed industrial processes. So even the nuclear power plant in Finland has got 3 types of heat. Some of the heat's making electricity. Some of the heat is giving district heating to the local communities. So they pipe the heat from the plant and they heat all of the apartments and factories and other things. And they are able to do that for the whole area that is covered by the electricity distribution as well. And then they take the lowest grade heat and they use it to melt the ice off the pavements in the winter so people don't have to scrape the pavements. So they have pipes that go underneath them. Now, if you take that and you move it into chemical industries and whatever, anything that we make with heat cannot be replaced with hydrogen. I'm a bit of an expert on hydrogen. I also had a mate of mine die in a hydrogen explosion in a lab, so I know how dangerous it is. You would never let children and hydrogen in a house, by the way. I urge you to never allow that to happen because you will kill people and the teenagers will help. And it's a really, really dangerous gas. So the key thing is that the urge to not have an economy and to think that you don't have to have process heat, which is about 60% of your total heat, about 40% is electrons, would be a problem.
Yes, I think that I agree with that. I've always been struck by this ambition, often used to support the idea of having renewables, where there'd be sort of vast excesses at certain times of day, and certain, when the wind's blowing and the sun's shining, you've got huge amounts of totally free electricity that you don't know what to do with the idea that means that you would have some other fuel-producing process that produces hydrogen, produces ammonia to sort of soak up all that free stuff, because at the end of the day, industrial processes require capital-intensive machinery, and the best way to use your capital-intensive machinery is to have it run all the time. And so the idea that we have a kind of a plethora of other alternative capital-intensive bits of machinery that we propose will just run some of the time when we've got this excess abundance, I've always found a rather it's a rather backwards way of coming forwards. I just don't see how they make that add up economically, because the prospect for us having things like fuels, transport, heavy industry run requires that you have good capital utilisation, and steady, reliable, controllable baseload seems to be the only way of doing that.
Great. Now, if we can keep our questions reasonably short and to the point, I think we have a question over here. This gentleman in the red, in the red shirt. Yes. Sir.
Rafe Champion. The question is, why do you keep referring to clean energy as though carbon, CO2, is dirty?
So let me explain biological life, okay? We breathe in the atmosphere because we need oxygen, and we dramatically increase the amount of carbon dioxide that is a very small amount of the air that we breathe in, and we breathe it out, and that is what feeds plants. And that cycle of people like us breathing stuff out generates the plants. Coal is old plants, okay? So it's previous generations of carbon dioxide. No matter what you believe about carbon dioxide, is it's plant food. So the most important thing now is that we're living in a really interesting time in the geological history of the planet when we're relatively low carbon. So it's correct to say that increasing carbon a little bit is not going to dramatically change the climate. The plants will grow better. The forests the forests are already expanding across the Sahara. The Sahara used to be a forest. Okay, what was it? 5,700 years ago, the forest started to die. Don't you know about the forest? The Sahara didn't used to be a desert. It was a forest. And so we will gradually reforest the world with all the excess carbon dioxide, and all the places that the deserts will spread into other places. You see, climate change is terrible because the deserts are disappearing. Okay, so the red middle of Australia will gradually become light green and vote for another party. Right.
So there's a question over here.
Great debate. Thanks very much indeed. Can we talk about submarines? We've put our toe in the water there. Is that going to have any currency over the next decade? Will they ever arrive, and will that expand the footprint of the nuclear industry?
Sure. Good question. Submarines is another passion topic of mine. I'm a big fan of nuclear submarines. I'm a big fan of diesel-electric submarines too. I think they suit different purposes, and Australia has one of the most odd and distinguished geographies where we have a better business case than most people for having both, which is a strong statement, but I don't think they're without merit. Do we get them? I'm deeply worried, and I think that a lot of the strategic community is worried too, because it looks like we've assumed we'll get them quickly from the United States. The United States desperately needs to keep as many of its nuclear submarines available for its own force, and I think that's a delicate assumption that we rest on there. I would love to see us develop a long-term capability for nuclear submarines in this country. I think it would be ideal that we have a long-term nuclear civil power industry as well. I think they complement each other extremely well. The young men going to submarines become brilliantly qualified nuclear operators, and a bit older, later in life, families, etc., they might have a job to do, which is respected and well paid in society. So I think we can do both of them. On the submarines front, I think that the nuclear submarines are a great long-term ambition. They are potentially a high-risk, short-term stopgap solution, and I'm terribly worried that's what we're actually expecting from them at the moment.
So I think that's a great summary. So 2 companies, Electric Boat in the United States, it's a single company, is the only manufacturer of submarine propulsion units in the United States. That is not going to be duplicated on Australian soil. Rolls-Royce produces the submarine reactors for the UK fleet up in the corner of Scotland. 2 companies. Electric Boat, I think, is a 100% owned subsidiary of McDonnell Douglas, which builds our tanks. So there's a relationship there. Okay. Electric Boat is flat-strapped at the moment, just keeping the US fleet together. Rolls-Royce is a fascinating company. They can make aero engines. I'm less sure about their capability of making things that go in the back of submarines. That's the supply chain. You can catch me in a small corner. We can talk for 2.5 hours, and I explain to you why it's going to be challenging. I think you've already said that. But I want to come back to something else that's important. In order to capture the knowledge of having a submarine program, you need 2 reactors on shore. A test and evaluation reactor. You probably need 3 actually, but we'd only be allowed 1. Well, we're not allowed any. I'll come back to that. A test and evaluation reactor, which allows you to stress test what happens in a real submarine reactor, and then your training reactor, which can't be done digitally. There's no digital reactor that will ever run fast enough to have a reasonable, difficult event that you'll get in a submarine. So you have to have an onshore training reactor. The official policy of this government and the Liberal Party is that we will never have a test and evaluation reactor or a training reactor onshore in Australia. So the two critical elements, so the idea at the moment is that we'll have fly-in, fly-out training. Don't ask me about the paper industry, that's a different story. Yeah, paper's one of the key things that modern industrial economies make. We don't make paper anymore. So how you think you can get the back end of a submarine sorted out if you can't make paper? That's just an aside. So basically, the predicate that we will have fly-in, fly-out training for the people who are looking after our most critical underwater resources, when we already have the best underwater resources in the world. The Collins submarine has the record, it has to put a snorkel up to get new oxygen in, for being underwater for the longest time, for the longest journey under ice in the world, the Australian Collins submarine. We know about submarines. We will never build them in this country, in my humble opinion. You're going to make big forgings. They will never give you the stuff that's in the heart of that submarine. So if that is true, and if I'm even half right, it's not a stepping stone to nuclear power. We need to get back to strategy in Australia. Best nuclear lawyer in the world. She's very humble, but she has written the book on nuclear law. What edition are you in, boss?
Third.
She's in her third edition of the best nuclear law book. She decided to get interested in nuclear law. She's in Sydney. She's influencing countries all over the world. Why is she not sitting in Canberra explaining this to politicians?
That's a good question. And this is another question that comes out of your work, I've got to say, Aidan. I mention it in a free market think tank, but it looks like you see that there's a huge role for government in building nuclear energy. And in fact, when you use the free market, it mostly doesn't appear to be working, or at least that seems to be part of the conclusion you come to.
Well, that's right. That might be. It sounds like too strong a conclusion, but when I looked, it was actually different to that. It hasn't really been tried anywhere except in the United States. If you look almost around the rest of the world, they either have their own state-run nuclear energy company, or they have a group of regulated monopoly district electricity providers that are declared to be the electricity utility that provides all the poles and wires and power in that area. So the United States is really out there on a limb when it comes to having shown nuclear power developed by the free market. And I think there was a period in history where it was seemingly flourishing, and that was around about the 60s, where they had a number of different nuclear companies and quite private, quite independent utilities saying, we'll buy that reactor and we'll buy this reactor. And they built them in twos and threes, and they built 2 or 3 different types from 2 or 3 different companies, and sometimes jumbled up all the different steam supply systems and turbines in different combinations, and they have frankly a bit of a hodgepodge fleet. It's a big fleet, it runs beautifully today, but if you look back in history and say, do you want a fleet like that? I don't think we would. And today, they are struggling to get a next order placed from the market-led government. Market-led, government-enabled is I think the mantra. And they've got a perfectly warm supply chain for a now proven design that they have hard fought for through the Vogtle project, which did terribly but got there in the end. And they have multiple sites with existing licenses to just order that and start building today. And it's not happening. So it seems like the rest of the world has done it differently. They've all had some sort of level of either a regulated monopoly utility or a government-stated entity do it. And we'd have to ask the question, if we expect to lift the ban and have the free market fill in all the gaps and lift it away, what footsteps are we following in? And the only hope is that it'll happen like it did in the United States in the 60s.
Helen, you've got a view of the world, and I look at this graphic here of what it takes, what it costs to build in the United States, and the time it takes to build. They have the longest time and the highest price.
Yeah, look, our industry, we say that we're all about lessons learned, and I think that's true when it comes to nuclear safety, but I'm a little bit concerned that we are not all about lessons learned when it comes to just the fundamentals of nuclear new build and structuring smart nuclear energy programs. So clearly from Aidan's research, but just generally from looking around the world, the lesson at the moment is that nuclear energy programs do require government support. Now, that support can take various different forms. It doesn't have to mean that the government is the owner and operator. There are many different structures that can be employed to support nuclear projects to get them off and running, but certainly at the start of a new nuclear program, the role of government is key. And it's key both on that owner-operator side, but it's also key, as we started off talking about, on the legal and regulatory infrastructure side. Getting that right, getting that in place, doing that in a smart way, that's important too, and that's the role of government.
I'd like to bounce on that quickly, if I may, Chris, because I think what the role is, it does not necessarily have to be the case that the government has an ongoing subsidy role where they keep shoveling money out of the pocket to keep things going. What I think they do need to do is setting the right direction, deciding how much of what sort of thing we need in roughly what sort of place, and making that happen. And there's a few different ways that you can skin the cat there. But in terms of setting the strategic direction, the capacity to make strategic investments, I think the government has to have an impact at that level, and ideally it should not involve ongoing losses and subsidisation from the taxpayers.
Okay, we only have a couple more minutes to go, so I want to take a few more questions from the floor. I'll take one down here and then one at the back, but I'll give you my microphone because it's...
Thank you. I'm Christina Talako, and I run a small environmental charity called Coalition for Conservation. I've done quite a few trips around the world to do due diligence on nuclear. But what we discovered, and bringing it back to reality, is other countries managed to either start a nuclear energy industry or are starting because of bipartisanship, which is what we're not being able to reach in this country. And I can see that the discourse is bringing people more apart and further away from each other between the opposition and the current government. So my question is, how do we make this message and narrative reach a wider audience? Because here, you know, we're all friends and we're all pro-nuclear. How do we make this a wider message, and how do we bring communities along? Because the next thing that the opposition has to do is to tell the public where are the SMRs going to be, and there's definitely a situation now where not in my backyard will play a part.
So I think that's a great question. First of all, I think we need all three types. I think we need gigawatt scale to go into places where we've already got coal plants. We need small modular reactors sort of on the edges of cities, filling in for complex data centres and other things. And we need nuclear batteries across the top of Australia to replace the diesel grid. None of you will have heard of the diesel grid. I've examined the diesel grid. Most of the northern Australia runs on diesel, and nuclear batteries would be perfect for that. So we need all three. I think that the second thing that is really important to this discourse is that young people across most of the political spectrum are already significantly pro-nuclear. So young people who are going to live with these reactors have already made up their mind. And therefore stick with the young people who will explain it slowly to old people like me. Okay. So that's the first theory, is the young people get this and they're not panicked about the past, and they really are quite eclectic in what they look at. I'm the chair of a Nuclear for Australia group. Will Shackle, who you might have heard of, is the champion of that. Put up your hand, young man. James helps us with that work. Talk to him about nuclear. So Will Shackle has got a group of young people across the country, 6 or 7, who are going to build regional coalitions and discussion. The most important way to change people's minds is to get small groups of people talking about this with a few facts. Telling people where you're going to build plants is a poison pill, frankly, because they'll bring out the people and they'll be like it was at Lucas Heights, and people will be standing out the gates with balloons and so on. We used to collect all the posters there in the museum at Lucas Heights, all right? So don't get points where the conflict can be amplified and gets onto the TV. Get the conversation in the RSLs, in the clubs, in the basements of places where people are doing it tough because of the cost of electricity. That's my thought.
All right, look, we'll take one last question because we're going over time now, but if there was a question at the back here.
Yes, I come from Lithgow, which has got the Mount Piper power station that's owned by the Chinese Light and Power Company. They're getting tremendous subsidy of millions of dollars to build a hydro scheme. I think anecdotally most people do want to look at nuclear, yet we never get the information up there to be able to have it presented to us so that we can see, which is better, just to compare them.
Thanks so much for coming, and I think that's a great perspective, and I have a different take of sorts on the challenge. I think that is the political and social battle to change the landscape and make nuclear possible, because I think that a lot of communities and a lot of regional places, I don't think are as anti-nuclear as what you would think of Australia if you just read the newspapers and the government rhetoric, assuming that there's a sort of a 50-50 kind of hostility side there, that it's sort of we're nowhere near that. My impression is that there's a lot more openness, and I think it's very strong in the regions. And I know, and I've spoken to a lot of people that are from regions as well, and I think that their sense that they're a little bit, sadly, isolated from the analysis and the expertise that is in urban centres about how to really, advocate for or engage with the energy system and the changes happening. I think it's a real problem. But broadly, I'm encouraged by what I hear from people in the regions and also from young people. And I actually have an optimistic take on the overall prospects for Australia, because I think that there is only a very small group of people who are vehemently and strongly and fearfully opposed to nuclear. I don't think that's the majority of Australia. I think that a lot of Australia is at least open to hearing about it. And I think that once they grasp a reason to actually incorporate that in our future, I think that could happen quite quickly, and it might be very hard to reverse once we realise that. And I think that the tipping point will be, do we feel like we are currently on a safe, cheap, affordable glide path towards net zero on the current trajectory, where nuclear is knocking us off something that we know that we can rely on? Or do we actually need this for other serious reasons, and there's something going wrong in the current trajectory we're on? I think it's going to be critical, and I'm optimistic that will happen and can happen quite quickly and might last.
I want to add one other thing that you can take home with you. Drop the word environmental, because it doesn't mean anything anymore, and introduce the word ecology. Nuclear is the best for the ecology of our country. Renewables are destroying the ecology of our country. True environmentalists care about the ecology, the things that grow in the earth.
All right, and that's where we'll make an end for today. We could go on forever, but I'm sure that Tom needs to get his building back.
Well, let me say, please join me in thanking Chris, Aidan, Helen and Adi. Thank you, Chris. And just a couple of things before we depart. Adi mentioned Will Shackle. Will was one of our keynote speakers at our annual concilium on the Gold Coast last year. And he's an absolutely outstanding young man. He's only in year 12 at high school, and he's leading this young lobby group in defence of nuclear energy. And following on from the excellent question, it is absolutely true. All the available polling evidence shows that Gen Z and millennial Australians strongly support nuclear energy. So that is something to bear in mind. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.